Police. Can't live with them. Can't live without them. To me, this is probably the most highly scrutinized topic that we'll discuss today. This is just my opinion. Just in the last few weeks, we've had several mass shootings and many high-profile incidents involving citizens and police officers. We're obviously fresh off the recent court decision involving George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. Whenever these situations unfold, we're drawn back into the conversation about the police force and its relationship to regular citizens and if it should be improved, or if and how it should be improved. Excuse me. Some people think we should defund the police, but then what does that look like? People like Steven Pinker advocate that violence is actually prevented due to the presence of law enforcement, while others believe we all have the capacity and control of we can control the population just with our own human nature. Some see police departments as a necessary and good public service, while others see them as an overly aggressive bully, obsessed with power and control, who do not have the civilians' best interest in mind. Our moderator for this panel is our great friend of mine and one of our founding myth-informed persons, my man, Brian Edwards.
There's a few other people that are supposed to be up here with me, Justin. So I guess if he doesn't read the intros, I'm going to have to.
Rogan O'Hanley, also known as DC Drano, is a former Hollywood entertainment lawyer that now posts conservative commentary, news, and videos on social media. He earned his law degree from the University of Chicago Law. Sean Fitzgerald is a John Jay College graduate with 2 degrees in criminal justice. Sean is also the owner and content creator for the YouTube channel Actual Justice Warrior, where he covers criminal justice issues as well as politics from a libertarian perspective. And he hit 100,000 subscribers today. Riley Grace Roshong is currently a dual JD Master's in Public Policy student at the University of Maryland. Before moving to Baltimore, Riley acted as a program director for Constance Abbey, a homeless outreach organization in Memphis, Tennessee. Riley has been elected co-chair of the Law's student LGBT+ organization and joined the board of directors for Free State Justice, where she serves as an executive board member. She has also done policy work in state and federal Congress. John Doyle is a popular conservative political commentator whose work has been featured in the New York Times and Newsweek, among others. He was banned from Twitter the day following the 2020 election for telling people to contact their representatives, which was arbitrarily defined as spam and harassment by the company.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate it. Up here by myself, I'm not going to do much good. When, however many months ago, in August last year, myself and some of the myth-informed team members came down to Kenosha to see what was going on for ourselves with the protest and later riots that happened in the wake of the Jacob Blake shooting. And when we came down, when we popped up a live stream, right before we did that, the first thing we run into is some guy pulls up next to us and he stops his motorcycle and he looks at us and he says, I hope you're here. I hope you're not here to harm the city. We're scared. And that was real because this guy this was a plea because he didn't know us. He perceived us as outsiders, that maybe we're here to do damage. And it showed to me that this goes even farther beyond policing, but it very much affects the communities in which these controversial things take place. So the reason why we had decided to have the event in Kenosha wasn't to rile up to be provocative, but rather to support the businesses that had been ravaged by some of the destruction and support a town that really had like the lightnings of this political storm that's going on. So that's why we're here. And I thought we'd get right to it. I thought we would get really right to the question that I think is on everyone's mind, the big debate. Are police systemically racist? And John, we'll go with you first. That question. And I want everybody, I'm going to give that to everyone.
No.
And you can get a little bit of time to elaborate.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Not too well.
Oh, okay, then why don't we flip over? Let's start over with Riley then instead.
Okay, wait, is mine working? There we go. Hey everyone, how's it going? So, we have to back up a little bit because I know that a lot of people are going to expect me to come here as like the only left-leaning person on this panel, expect me to come in here like, oh, ACAB, abolish the police are all terrible, police are all racist. I don't hate the police, and I want to protect their respect, and I want to keep them safe, all right? So can we all agree that's like a good thing at the foundation, all right? Can we all agree that's broadly a good thing? Cool, on the same side. So it's important to be able to recognize a couple things in these conversations, right? In my opinion. The first and foremost is that the reason why we want to keep them safe, and maybe we all just take this for granted, but a big reason why it seems we want to keep them safe is because we all acknowledge that their job is difficult. It's dangerous. The reason it's dangerous is because it necessitates using violence or some kind of harm. And I think that's important for these conversations, right? Because when we get into the conversation about, oh, police are all terrible, police, we need to get rid of them, it's because most people broadly acknowledge that like they do cause harm because that's what they're designed to do. That's how we keep rapists and murderers in check. Like that is a good thing for the state to do sometimes. The problem usually happens, in my opinion, when you have instances where the restrictions are too low and the amount of harm that they do outweighs the benefit that we want them to have. And I would say in a lot of ways that we have some failures in regulating them right now. Right now, we end up disproportionately killing more people with our police than most other comparably developed civilized, or not civilized countries, like developed democratic countries, let's use that language. And we end up disproportionately killing people of color, despite the fact that they tend to be more likely to be unarmed, and despite the fact that they tend to be and despite the fact that usually it's regardless of criminality or like the nature of the crime, right? And so why is that? We get into this question of, all right, so they're being killed disproportionately. We have police disproportionately killing everyone, including white people, right? Including anyone in this room, right? We all have an increased risk because we're here in the United States, and then black people in particular have a higher likelihood. So why is that? Well, a lot of people would say that it has to do, I don't know, maybe.
But is it systemically racist in your opinion?
Well, I would say that this tends to be what people are talking about when they talk about systemic racism, right? That's not necessarily every individual person in the police being racist, but rather that we have a system by virtue of its construction that ends up disproportionately killing people of color. That would be what I would say it is.
I'm going to say that's a mostly yes. Okay, and then back to you with your mic working now.
Yes. So I think that in terms of whether or not systemic racism exists within the police, I would be inclined to say no with that. It's sort of like the evidence is so clear, it reminds me of a certain tweet from President Trump where someone said something that was just so absurd, he simply replied with, "Is this even possible to believe?" I mean, she mentioned that, for example, that people of color are disproportionately killed by police. Well, this is true. However, when you take into account their likelihood of committing violent crime and the arrests that are made, that discrepancy goes away. And even then, if you look at, for example, according to the FBI, if you have 10,000 arrests being made with black people and with white people, there will be 3 shootings amongst the black population, but there will actually be 4 shootings amongst the white population if you look at simply people who are being arrested for violent crime amongst a sample size of, I think it was 10,000. And then even as far as police officers, if we're using the metric of racism, their propensity towards shooting people of color versus people who are white, they have studies that they've done where, you know, they do simulations and they find that white police officers are actually less likely to shoot minority suspects than non-white police officers. They're actually, even in the field, that also holds up. And so we sort of have this like almost juvenile 1970s nostalgia of like, the system is bad, man. I don't trust the system. It's like, what is that? system. It's like we need to identify specifically what we're talking about here. And when we do actually get into the metrics that would imply or suggest racism, it turns out that it's not actually true when we look at the data that's provided to us by law enforcement. So.
Okay, cool. And then, Sean, I'm going to give you next, and then Rogan, and then I'll give you a chance then to respond again, Ron.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Can I be heard? Okay, I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to double up on that, like what we see is like a very low-level analysis whenever we talk about disproportionately being killed by the police. I have a friend, and he likens this to the God of the Gaps arguments that you would hear in a lot of atheists versus Christians debates. And what essentially happens is people find a gap, and they fill that gap with racism. And this is the racism of the gaps argument. So we hear about black people being killed more in proportion to their population, but in reality, your numbers as a population do not determine how you're going to interact with the police. Obviously, the level of crime in your communities, and when you control for those factors, as John pointed out, they're not being killed disproportionately, and they're actually slightly under-targeted or underrepresented in those instances. It's just that the rates of violent crime are significantly higher. And as for the overall shootings in the United States of America, yeah, that's a thing that happens. And you can compare us to other modern Western countries and say, look, our police are so much more violent. Our population is so much more armed. If you're an officer in the United States of America, you have to assume that the likelihood of somebody having a gun somewhere is significantly higher than in London, where the police don't even carry guns, or Sweden, or whatever. Like, it's a different animal being a police officer in the United States of America.
Okay. And Rogan, what's your starting position? Are the police systemically racist?
Absolutely not. But there is massive systemic racism in the Democrat Party and in their major media friends. That is where the systemic racism is located. And per a Harvard study, since people have started to discuss disproportionate use of force against black or white by police, Ronald Fryer is a Harvard professor who is also black. And he put out a study in 2016 where he, and I quote, said it was the most surprising results he had ever seen. He was a black man. He grew up in the South. He expected this data that he had analyzed from 2000 to 2015 across 7 major cities in this country, including Houston, Los Angeles, and others. And he found that while black people, yes, are disproportionately there is a use of force against them higher than their white counterparts, adjusted for their numbers in society, but the actual use of lethal force against unarmed black men was actually at a lower rate than white people. And that study was also corroborated by 2 other subsequent studies. So again, no, the police are not systemically racist. They're some of the best people in our country. They're willing to put their lives on the line to save people they've never met, and to clean up the mess of the Democrat Party. The most violent cities in this country are nearly all controlled by Democrats. Police are their scapegoat. They are the excuse. Shame on them.
Okay, so we have mostly yes and 3 no's. So I'll back you up a little bit, Riley, because we're just for balance. But to Rogan, what do you make of, like in Roland Fryer's study, what do you make of the fact that black people seem to be roughed up more?
Well, that's actually a good question, and Professor Fryer is not necessarily sure either why that happens. You know, there is no proof that there is a racial bias involved with the police that are engaged in these uses of force. I personally think that there is in the black community, you know, they call it the talk. And it's parents, they talk to their kids and they say, hey, you know, you got to be really careful with the police. They are not going to treat you the same way, you know, they would necessarily treat white people. And it's a sad state of affairs, and it's something I've talked with people a lot, actually. But, you know, I think also having that inherent distrust of authority figures with uniforms on, then amplified and exacerbated by major media and Hollywood inflammation of police-citizen relationships, where they say white, you know, cops are out there hunting black people. that they are going to shoot you no matter what, who wouldn't be scared? Who wouldn't, run away or resist arrest? So I think that there's a problem in the culture in terms of how people interact with police and not resisting arrest because, I was taught, keep your hands on the wheel, turn your music down when you get pulled over. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And things will work out as good as they can. It won't always work out in your favor. So I think that there is a cultural problem, not necessarily within the people, but I think it's this big lie pushed by major media in Hollywood.
All right, choose your own adventure, Riley. Where do you want to respond?
Oh, Lord. All right, give me a little bit. I want to work through some of this, but it's also 3-on-1, so be a little charitable. So first with you two. So both of you made similar arguments about how yes, all of it. First off, can I just get broad agreement that people of color are being disproportionately killed by the police, regardless of the cause? We all agree that that's happening, right? No, you don't agree that there's disproportionate killing of black people?
Not according to the data put out by.
If
That
you're
Roland
not,
Fryer at Harvard, I think. Is
if
what you
your
said.
only factor is population, then yes, but.
Right, we're talking about per capita, right?
Yeah,
so if
but-
you are black, you're more likely, regardless of, again, we're putting cause on the shelf for a second, that if you are black, you are more likely to be killed by the police. Again, causation.
Unarmed or armed?
I believe that most of the data out right now suggests that it's despite being unarmed. Right now, again, we're putting causation on the shelf for a second. We can just agree, starting point one, that black people are being killed disproportionately, regardless of causation.
I guess it would depend on the metric, whether you want to go per encounter by police, which as we discussed was actually disproportionately affecting white people, or if you want to go purely by their proportionate representation in the population. Which would make more sense? In my opinion, it would be per violent crime arrest would make more sense.
All right, well, I believe that the studies, and if you want to, I'm collected all the information on this, so I'm free, I can share it with you if you want to. But it seems like most metrics that we use show that they are more likely to be disproportionately killed. I just want to get understanding, we can talk about causation, and there's going to be a lot of talk about causation, but I just want us to kind of it sounds like we all agree on this, so I just want to make sure that we're on agreement of this.
Yeah, if we're just going strictly population to kills, then yeah. They
Okay.
do not they represent more than 13% of people killed by police.
Okay, cool.
Unarmed, I disagree. In terms of them being armed and firing back at police or attacking them with knives or bats, and then they're killed potentially at higher rates than white people,
I don't
that
think
may enter into less of those confrontations, yes. But in terms of unarmed, per the data I've read in 3 different studies, no, it is not true.
Okay, well, I've read, I don't know, maybe we're reading completely different studies because I've read most, if not all the studies on this, and it seems like it's despite being more likely to be unarmed, that they're still getting killed. So it's there's clearly a disproportionality of it, even people of color who are unarmed are being killed by the police.
Do we know how many people of color are killed by police each year that are unarmed and are not trying to attack somebody else or the police officer? I know that a plurality of people who are left-leaning and even far left-leaning, I saw this morning, the plurality of those people estimate that it's north of 100, somewhere between 100 and 1,000. The Washington Post even acknowledges that it's 10, maybe 9?
Yeah, it's 10 to 15 per year.
It could be. That again, we're putting, I just
I
want
agree.
to put
I also
causation
I'm skeptical
on,
of the Washington Post as well, but in this particular case,
Okay, yeah. I'm just trying to put causation. It sounds like we broadly agree. I don't know. We can, if we want to talk more about that, then sure. It sounds like we just have a conflict in our sources, so we can talk about that more later. But all right, YouTube, broad agreement, cool. Let's work with this. So police are being disproportionately killed, or people of color are being disproportionately killed by police. You said it's in proportion to the amount of violence that they commit. I haven't really. There's kind of a, I don't know. My contracts professor taught me this term where it's called yine, where it's yes and no together. So yine. And basically there's this idea that step one, actually when you measure police brutality, it doesn't seem to correlate in most cities that are measured with the amount of violent crime that's being committed. What does predict the amount of violent crime or the amount of police brutality or police excessive use of force in cities is usually poverty. And then step 3, black people tend to disproportionately inhabit communities with poverty, so that they end up feeling the effect of that a lot more than most other people. That seems to be the case. Now from there, we can have a cool discussion about what to do with that, because I think I've watched a video of yours where you got into an argument to say that actually policing in these areas as they are right now, because of that fact, are justified. Is that your position? I'm not owning that position. I'm just asking if that's your position.
I mean, policing them because they're poor is not justified, but policing people based on reports of crime is totally justified and intelligent.
Yeah. Like poverty is a good predictor of violent crime. You'd agree with that?
I actually wouldn't disagree. I would disagree with that. Like, we see people with higher rates of poverty in different demographics in the United States of America, and they have varying levels of crime.
No, we're not talking. All right. So when I say predictor,
I'd say they generally would correlate, but it's not a one-to-one. And I'm firmly under the belief that crime drives prolonged poverty.
Right. But I mean, like, what I'm talking about, I'm not talking about a one-to-one causation. I'm talking about something being causative of another thing in terms of like just increasing the likelihood of it happening, right? It could be a 10% likelihood, it could be a 20% likelihood, but just the fact that there is a causative relationship between these two qualities, right? Would you at least agree that like the existence of one is going to make the other more likely?
I think you see them in the same area, like they correlate, but I don't think they cause each other. That's where I'm disagreeing with you.
Okay, so why do you disagree with that then? Because it seems like of the literature I've read, it seems to be that that's the consensus, that that's like one of the driving, like even if we want to say that's not the main one, that it's like a really big driving factor in violent crime.
Well, I mean, you can look at statistics over time. In the 1950s, the black crime rate was actually dropping, and they were significantly poorer than they were in the 1970s. It's not a predictor. Like, they're related. Sure, poor areas are likely to have more crime, but it's not like one causes the other. Like, in a simple sense, an individual incident, if you need money and you rob a bank because you need money, sure, but over like a span, they're like correlated, but they're not, one's not causing the other.
I think that, all right, then maybe we can, I'm trying to just like get an understanding of your position on this. So maybe it would be a better statement if I'm reframing what you said. All right, maybe it's, if we don't want to say that like it's the main predictor, that it's like a predictor. Right, that it's like something which does contribute. Maybe there are other factors that also contribute, but it is a contributor.
There are other factors. I've been spending the last few minutes deciding whether or not I wanted to bring this up. I've decided that I'm going to. As far as predictors go, something that was interesting, there was a longitudinal study done over the course of about 35 years, I think, in like 26 or 2,300 counties in the United States. And what they found was that the prevalence in the county of black Americans is actually a greater predictor of violent crime than the prevalence of poverty within that county. This kind of, I think, goes more along with the cultural arguments that you could make as opposed to poverty causing crime. And even if you look in countries that have less, really what it comes down to, I think, is inequality, less than poverty. Because countries that have, not to get all income inequality on the panel, but countries that have less disparity between where their wealth is distributed have lower rates of violent crime than we do. And so I don't think it's as simple as just like, oh, they're poor, and so if we throw money at them, then they're going to stop committing violent crime. Because even like you can look at, according to the FBI, black Americans who are in the top income bracket in the country are still more likely to commit violent crime than white Americans who are in the lowest income bracket in the country. I don't understand how that could substantiate the poverty explanation. I think it's much more of a cultural thing.
So all right, there's a couple things there. So first, can you repeat like the finding in the initial study? I'm sorry, like I've been spending like weeks reading all the literature on this.
Repeat the thing that'll get you canceled? Yeah. So they found that the prevalence in the county of black Americans is actually a better predictor of violent crime within that county than the prevalence of poverty.
How did they do that measurement? I'm super curious. No, I'm just interested because like this seems to run counter to like all the literature I've read, because the literature seems to suggest right now that black people in a community is not a good predictor of the amount of police brutality in those areas, right? So that seems to, and like there's a lot of studies that say that, so it's really weird to hear like this that seems to run counter to that.
Studies are fake, as a general rule.
Oh, okay, studies are fake.
Well, I'm actually going to agree with you on this, that your black population is not a one-to-one predictor of crime. So I live in New York City. There's 2.1 million black people in New York City. The population of Chicago total is 2.7 million. 700,000 residents, I believe, are black. New York has lower, not just per capita crime rates or per capita homicides, but lower raw numbers of homicides every year. And this is despite the fact that our black population is almost equivalent to the entire population of Chicago. And statistically, it would be equivalent. Like, one is 2.7, 2.1. Like, you can gather data from this, and it's totally, like, it would totally be doable. So it's actually not like the best predictor. If you're saying that your black population in a certain city is likely by the numbers within that city to commit more crime compared to like other neighborhoods, maybe, but I haven't looked into that and found that one-to-one. We have wildly different per capita crime rates among black populations in the United States of America. And sometimes they're in cities that are close together. Like Detroit's homicide rate is significantly higher than Chicago. They're not that far apart from one another. It's not the best predictor.
You want to say something? You look like you're about to say something.
Yeah, who here has heard of the term fighting Irish?
I went to Notre Dame, so
Yeah.
Right.
once or twice.
And, you know, it's a stereotype that's largely true. Irish people like to fight, and I didn't realize it. I am Irish. I grew up in the Boston area, and it's very common. And I didn't realize how common it was until I moved to other parts of the country, and people don't fight all the time. And I think it goes back to the roots of, you know, Irish immigration into this country. They were fleeing famine. And I'm actually probably going to counter their arguments a bit and explain something. But when the Irish came to America, they were treated like animals. You know, they were seen as less than. They were in ghettos. And you know what? If you put 2 hungry dogs in a cage and only 1 bone, guess what? The dogs are probably going to fight at some point. But if you put 2 bones in that cage, they'll probably split it and be generally happy. And the bones are symbolic for economic opportunity, okay? And to me, yes, is there certain violence in, you know, racial demographics? Is there higher rates? Sure. But you know what else there is? A lot less economic opportunity in these communities. And, you know, my sister is a ex-convict. She's a heroin addict. And she's been in and out of jail many years throughout her 20s. And she recently has been cleaner, and she's got a great job, and she's selling cars. And she goes, you know what, Mom? I am so much less likely to commit crime because I don't want to lose this job. And when you are employed, you are a better citizen. When there are jobs out there for you, when you have an income, and especially as a man, when you have a purpose in your profession, you're a better person all around. And then throw in a family, and you're as good as it gets. So again, this goes back to my argument that the biggest racists in this country are the leaders, not necessarily the followers, the leaders of the Democrat Party, because for decades, they have continued to neglect these communities. They've sold them lies. They give them welfare checks and say, that's all you need. You know, they tell, oh, it's the police, you should just fight them, and it leads to catastrophic consequences. A lot of this problem is, or a lot of the police reform argument is like, if you had cancer and one of the symptoms was that you got itchy and you itched it, and the debate is whether you should itch it this way or that way, and maybe you're not addressing the root cause of the problem. And that's horrible, horrible economic policies in this country, largely driven, in my belief, by our open borders system, something that Bernie Sanders has said hurts the most poor people in this country because it produces an overabundance of employment labor. Wages go down, fewer jobs. Now guess what? You're left to a life of crime. And then once you're in jail and you have that on your record, good luck getting a job, because when there's so many people to choose from, why would they choose the person that's been in jail? So I think we absolutely need to shut down the borders again. And I think we need to also have a little bit of employment reform in terms of giving people a second chance. And that will reintegrate them into society and make things better for everyone.
Riley, you've got to choose your own adventure again.
Yeah, so I'm going to use this term again, yayin, just because like there was a lot that you said there. There are some things that I did agree with though, right? Like reducing poverty is going to have like a really good effect in making sure that people are disincentivized from wanting to commit crime, right? And that is something that I broadly agree with. That's like one of, so like if we're talking about policies, solutions to make sure that this problem, so that we can actually like deal with the problems that we're talking about, that's probably one of my main ones, is like economic reform, making sure that we're actually investing in communities and giving them more job opportunities. You know, like that all seems broadly good for reducing crime, so that police don't have to respond, so that we aren't getting riots or whatever, or like things, like broadly speaking, reducing crime is probably good, right? So to go back to bring that back into the conversation over here, because I'm not forgetting about it. So like, I guess that this kind of ties into when we're talking about systemic racism, because even, like, I'm not trying to say that police are all individually racist. There's like some evidence that they're, like, for example, if you were all listening to the panel earlier, there's like a study that came out that after sunset, even controlling for like driving habits, or like if people follow the law, that police are still more likely to arrest black people at day when they're able to be seen compared to night. That's like some evidence that police are individually racist, but most studies, it seems to say that like the causes are broadly systemic insofar as like we have this over-policing of specific communities, despite the fact that it doesn't correlate with violence, even though, and one of the main causal factors is that it correlates with poverty. Now, I think that you would say, and this is where I wanted to pick up, is that like you would say, I think you'd say that that's justified, that like since there is more crime being committed in these areas, then it's good to be able to police those areas. I think that's your belief, but it seems like, because again, the study seems to show that like even taking that into account, police are still policing these areas too much, right? And end up causing disproportionate harm. Because remember, police, by virtue of what they do, cause harm, right? Like that's kind of what we expect them to do. When they tase someone, when they arrest someone, when they shoot someone, like that's what they do. We just as a society decide that like in those instances it's good because it prevents those people, like we assume that in the worst case scenario it's able to protect everyone from like rapists and murderers, right? The problem is when you have police shove so much into these communities beyond whatever would be beneficial that we end up having a disproportionate amount of harm compared to what's useful, right? And that seems to be what one of the main problems is, right? I'm not saying to not police these communities, just like to bring it back in a little bit, because we've even observed that in areas where that's been tried, where we like reduce the policing in these areas and invest in them to give them the economic opportunities like what you were talking about, then we actually see an overall reduction in crime, which is good, because less crime means police have to report to less things, which means that they're going to be protected, and also less black people are killed. Hooray, lots of problems solved. So I don't see why we can't move towards those kind of solutions.
Yeah. So, like, as I was talking about earlier in my open, like, you're making a racism of the gaps argument, because I'm familiar with that traffic study. I believe it was South Carolina. And the difference in black people being stopped versus day and night is like 5%. So, yeah, there's a disparity between day and night, but it's minimal. It's 5%.
Well, it's
and
statistically significant, right?
But
it does exist. It's not that much, but it does exist.
But it being statistically significant doesn't mean that it's not unexplainable with other factors. Again, it's like a gap, and then you fill it with racism. So in the daytime, you might be more likely to see the person in the car. So if you're stopping for a suspect, in the daytime, you might pick the person that you're stopping for that matches the description. At night, you might be stopping the vehicle. So, like, I don't know how much that factors into it, but it could play a role. Like, we're talking about a minimal distinction between nighttime and daytime, and there's no, I don't know what the data is on even whether or not people are driving at different rates depending on the time of day. Like, it's like you can't just find a gap and say, here's a disparity, it must be racism. Like, you have to actually look for an explanation for the gap.
All right, so here we're running into a problem of just kind of like the limitations of studies, right? Because I mean, like, could there possibly be other explanatory factors? It's possible, but like with this kind of study, and again, like I'm saying this, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that police are all like individually racist, right? But there, we probably see like some kind of play of bias, right? Or at least that seems like at least the most likely explanation. And the way that we resolve that seems to be just like a better police training. Like, hey, police, we're going to do some more training with you, and we're going to make sure that we're going to try our best to make sure that you don't do these things, right? That doesn't seem like a really far out there solution, you know? Like, just improve training.
To talk about disproportionate employment of force, I'm familiar with that study. If I remember correctly, it didn't control for different driving behaviors. Maybe it did, but I do know that like black people, for whatever reason, are twice as likely to
I'm
not
pretty
wear
sure
their
it did
seatbelts.
control for
Well, if it did, then
driving.
even then it was 5%? So we burned down cities because 5% of the time they're like pulled over more. Or even then, Minneapolis, where St. Floyd is from. So that city actually had, I think it was 70% of the arrests being made there, or excuse me, 69% of the arrests being made there for violent crime were against black Americans. And then the statistics from that police department show that they actually commit 70% of the violent crime in the city, which means that they're actually being less represented in the total amount of arrests. Only by 1%, not statistically significant, however, right on the edge. Right on the edge, and yet Minneapolis burned to the ground. For what? For police racism that even when I guess we can't identify that it exists, it's like a statistical anomaly, maybe even borderline insignificant / significant. Also, I think you alluded to a study that was published, or at least alluded to in a Vox article, Vox.com, the quintessential example of American journalistic
I'm
integrity.
not citing Vox.
Well, you did mention, you said something to the effect of when there are less police, there's less crime, which is sort of this idea that like they're there and they're just bullying people and they're reporting more crime. And you mentioned that less people are killed, less black people are killed by police, which is true. I think this is the Ferguson effect. There were like 100 or maybe somewhere between 100 and 300 less black Americans killed by police in areas where they basically pulled out of because of the protests that we saw over the last 18 months. And resultantly, there was like between like 1 in 6,000, 3 in 6,000 additional homicides of majority black Americans because of that lack of police presence. So it's sort of like a cost-benefit thing.
I mean, like, that's not, like, what we observe. So there's a couple things, right? So first, studies on the Ferguson effect are really mixed. There's not, like, a clear consensus. What we have, so, like, as far as I think that you're talking about Minneapolis? Is that right? Because I know I had to look this up in preparation for this.
The 6970, that was Minneapolis, yeah.
Okay, cool. So, like, when we look at that, actually, there have been several people that have been looking into this, and what we see is that, like, there could be an argument that it was because of a lack of policing, but it seems much more likely that it was caused by COVID, right? That it was caused by the fact that people were locked inside. Because what you observed in Minneapolis during this time is actually, and also this was broadly the case for like across the entire United States, regardless of city affiliation politically, regardless of whether or not they instituted these kinds of new policies, that overall most crimes that would be committed out, say like in Publix, like robberies or like aggravated like robberies or like things that you commit like if you're walking around outside, right? Those kind of crimes all fell down. But homicides ended up increasing because of the fact that arguably people were stuck inside. I mean, like everyone in this room, I assume, has felt a little cooped up in the course of COVID, right? Like over the course of a year, right? Like have any of you kind of gotten sick of the people that you're living with? Like imagine that and then imagine that and then you take an entire population of like millions of people. Like, yeah, there's going to be some people who are more likely to fucking off whoever they're living with, right? But that's not because of a lack of policing. That's because people are stuck inside more, right?
I don't know if you saw what I saw over the summer, but nobody was stuck inside. I mean, in like all of the major cities, it's actually the only example where it was acceptable to not be stuck inside was when you're out protesting this zeitgeist of police brutality in American cities. It's just like that was the only example. People were not masked up. The white people were, shout out white people, but most people like weren't masked up. They were just out there crowding in like close proximity. We're trying to stop the spread.
All right, so like first off, yeah, I'll agree that like during those protests, not exactly the greatest way to be able to handle COVID, not a lot of social distancing, yeah, broad agreement. But what we saw, so like for example, I live in Baltimore, right? And there was like, I think a handful of protests, right? And then the rest of the year or the rest of the time during quarantine, everyone is stuck inside, right? So if you want to if you want to say that like all of those homicides are caused like during those protests, that seems pretty unlikely considering that like even if you want to say that there are some times where people end up committing violent crimes during COVID, I'm pretty sure there's a study that most of the time they end up being safe. You can point to like specific instances where there's like, oh, there's death here, there's death there, but like that would never account for the vast increase that we saw over this past year.
But it seems to me that what would account for that is more likely to be the lack of police in the neighborhood than this kind of like, little Johnny was mad that his sister took his phone charger, wasn't he? And then he just like went off to her. I mean, you can like read the articles like, oh, there was a block party in Chicago and then it was shot up and 6 people died. And it's like, well, why was that happening?
Wait, but police don't go into people's homes.
But I want to double up on that with actual like with numbers with New York City. So New York City, in response to the death of George Floyd, decided to get rid of the anti-crime unit. The anti-crime unit should be called the anti-shooting unit because that's what they deal with is shootings. So they get rid of it, and New York's shooting rates go back to 1990s levels, which we had the Great Recession in New York City during the Great Recession. A lot of people were out of work. Crime went down during the Great Recession in New York City. Shootings went down. They spiked significantly within a month of them changing this policy. And
Sure.
This is the undercover unit that goes out and deters shootings. And the reason they wanted to get rid of them was because they're like, well, they're more likely to shoot people, like shoot suspects, which, sounds sad. But then you're like, well, of course, the unit that is designed to deal with illegal guns and deter shootings is probably going to end up shooting people more than any other unit in the city. And in New York City, we also had our murder rate jump significantly, and it was already upticking in 2019 when de Blasio was implementing a more light version of these policies. But we went from about 300 murders to 450 from one year over another. And I don't think that's perfectly explainable due to like COVID, like poverty or whatever. I think the fact that the spike came in shootings post getting rid of the unit to deal with it and the murder rate jumped significantly in that latter half of the year because this happened near the summer, is more related. Sure, there's definitely people angry and antsy about COVID, 100%, but I think the overall factor is this change in policy. On top of that, like you talk about crime going down when they pull out the police. It depends on how you're measuring crime. So like one of the ways that people unsophisticatedly measure crime is through arrests. The police don't measure crime through arrests. They measure crime through reports. And they actually determine their patrols based on these reports. And they use a system called ComStat, where they'll map out crime geographically and they'll go and target race neutral just based on the level of crime that are being reported. And the reason you use reports instead of crimes is obvious. If you find a dead body, somebody was murdered, you don't wait for the person to be arrested before you call that a murder. You know it's a murder, and that's how it works with every single other crime. On top of that, some crimes are never reported, so we use the National Crime Victimization Survey to supplement that, and we haven't gotten that for 2020, but I'm sure that's not going to look very good either. And the disproportionate rates that we're seeing that people always try to attribute to arrests are in the reports, and they're also in the Crime Victimization Survey. So so if you give me like arrest numbers are down, it's like, yeah, sure, if there's no cops, there's not going to be any arrests. Like, I understand that. But we have to measure crime appropriately so we actually know what we're talking about.
Riley brought up Baltimore, and Baltimore actually stands out as a success story for the most part in the last year. They are actually one of the few major cities that has not seen a massive uptick in violent crime. And so, yeah, there is some justification to, show that maybe some of those inner city policies are working better. However, in most major cities, especially Chicago, Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, violent crime and murders are at unprecedented levels. And a lot of it is attributed to fewer police. Defund the police, Ferguson effect, whatever you want to call it. I unfortunately think that Baltimore is, going to be a bit of a delayed effect because they're short about 700 officers, and as people start getting out into society more, there's going to be those issues and upticks. But I will say, I was in Wilmington, Delaware, which is Biden's, hometown area, past Scranton. He has a lot of hometowns. And I was there for his DNC speech, and I wanted to, troll him a bit. It's kind of what I do on the side. And there's probably about 150, 200 Trump supporters there, and there was about 10 Biden supporters at his DNC speech. It was heavily fortified. It was only media, which, most votes in American history. You guys can stew on that one. And we were at this restaurant. There was a few of us. We were in MAGA hats, and this car pulls up with tinted windows and some, loud music. And I'm like, uh-oh. And they rolled down the window and like, yo, yo. And it was these black guys in the car. And we're like, hey. And they're like, yo, we love Trump. And I was like, really? And he starts talking. He's like, yeah, man, Biden ain't ever done anything. I go, hold on, stop. I take out my camera. I go, all right, now talk. So I put this on TikTok. I actually have a TikTok account. And I want you to hear his words, okay? And this is someone, he's probably 24. I think he's got a daughter, and he lives in the projects in Wilmington. And I just want you to hear his words. Hopefully this works.
You're not able to call the police or them be able to still do things for us. It's like it can go a whole nother level. Mm-hmm. If you're in Delaware, if you look at the crime rate in Delaware, the murder rate in Delaware, the homicide rate in Delaware, unbelievable. Kids, young kids, just.
So you're against defunding the police?
I'm against it because what's that going to stop? Yeah, what's going to stop? Police officers matter.
This guy talked to me after, and he's like, I'm afraid for my daughter to walk down the street. He's like, we don't need fewer police, we need more police. And it's something I have noticed, that the loudest voices calling for defunding the police. Have you seen where the BLM co-founder bought properties lately? mansions in some of the whitest areas of California. She wants you to be defenseless. They want you to not have guns. They want you to not have police while they go live in their white neighborhoods. AOC, she live in a rough neighborhood? No. Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan, Pelosi with her $25 ice cream. The people calling for this stuff, which I know some of you may not believe me, there is actually true evil at the top of the Democrat Party. All right? This is the party that fought for slaves. This is the party that was the home of most KKK members in the South. You want to talk where the distrust of the police comes from? It's from Southern Democrats that targeted these people. And this party...
I have to, wait, hold on. This is like a small point. Like, I'm letting you, I don't want to interrupt you because I respect you. We can acknowledge that, like, the Democratic Party in this respect is almost certainly more different from how they were earlier in the country's history.
Nah. Democrats.
Did they change their policies, or did they just camouflage them better?
Wait, hold on. We can't, like, it's really hard to be able to make that sell when the parties switched entirely from the different
big
parties.
Switch. Have you even read Dinesh D'Souza? He debunked that pretty thoroughly.
All right, wait, hold on. I just need to ask like a really quick question. So which party, like nowadays, is actually advocating against like laws which would protect the interests or protect like broadly people of color or minorities?
The reason for that, though, is quite pernicious, and I think Rogan and I would agree with this, because what they're doing, like the ultimate goal of the Black Lives Matter or progressive activist is to basically grift off racial grievances such that they can then escape the consequences of their policies. So they know that, and this is true with Hispanics or blacks or Asians, it's actually, they vote as a bloc almost uniformly, because since they're a minority in this country, they have to kind of use their political power effectively so that they can serve the interests of their communities, and so that's why they tend to stay pretty unified with that. And so the Democrat policies result in poverty. It's actually, this perhaps is actually, no, it's not at all.
Wait, which policies resulted in poverty?
We need more police in black communities because, like you said, there's no economic opportunities in there. Why is that? Because
wait, hold on. No, I didn't say that we need more police in black communities.
No, I said that. You said that we need less police in black communities and then people are going to come invest there. I think that's pretty counterintuitive. I think that you need order because law and order, as we know, are the cornerstones of prosperity, and you can't have that if people are like shooting buildings and burning them down. And so we actually would need more police in black neighborhoods to bring that investment back and that security back. I mean, even I'm from Detroit. Detroit used to be like epic. Now it's like not. The only place where it is because they have police there in what's referred to as the gentrified area, and that's where like all the businesses have come and invested. And so it's actually creating a nice little pocket that will eventually sprawl out into the neighborhoods as those economic opportunities return.
Except you're making an assumption that more policing is always going to result in a reduction of crime, and we know that's not the case.
Do we know that's not the case? Do we know that?
Yes, we do, actually. So not only are there studies that show what I mentioned earlier, which is that if you reduce policing in certain areas, and that's going to result in a reduction of crime. I wanted to come back because, I mean, like, you all are going to argue
being reported. Isn't that the idea that if there's less police officers to arrest people for crime, it won't get recorded, and the crime, it's like, if a tree falls in the woods, did it really fall if no one heard it?
People will still report the crime. Like, just because there aren't police in the area doesn't mean that people aren't going to report the crimes.
And that's why there's that discrepancy between what he mentioned, the National Crime Victimization Survey, and those reports if they are pulled out, because people are still being victimized, but it's not necessarily being solved because those police aren't there to solve it.
No, we're talking about reported instances of police misconduct.
It's three different metrics. It's arrests, which is the least useful, reports, which is more useful. It's what police departments use to determine their patrols because you get that better. And then there's victimization surveys that come at the end of the year, which it kind of helps us fill the gaps of what reports are. So crimes go down in terms of arrest, then obviously less police,
Right.
If they're going down in terms of reporting, then that's a different thing. Then you actually might have something there, but I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, if you want me to, I'll share the things that I've read. I've compiled them very neatly and nicely and orderly. But it seems to be the case that, when you do that and you also invest in those communities, that ends up reducing crime overall. Because again, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I haven't been, reinforced this enough, police, when they end up doing their job, which is using force, they do cause harm, and that kind of harm, whether it's displacement of people in those communities, whether it's setting back entire households because there are less people to be able to work in those households and be able to support each other, whether it's getting people involved in our criminal justice system, which is a whole nother discussion, and it ends up really harming people. Like, these are things which are going to end up contributing more to poverty, which ends up, in turn, contributing more to crime. And so the result, and again, I'm not saying to get rid of police entirely, right? And I'm definitely not. What we want is proportionality, and to be able to discuss what proportionality means. Because right now, we're over-policing them, even if we take into account the fact that they may commit higher crime because they live in communities of poverty. That's the issue.
So I agree with him that I think you have the causation backwards. Again, crime drives poverty. It's not the other way around. True. And I think an example might be able to better serve this. So like Walmart, everybody knows what it is. Walmart operates on a 1 to 3% profit margin on the volume that they sell. If your shoplifting in a certain area is above 1 to 3% of inventory, it's slightly higher than other areas, then you're not going to get a Walmart in your area, and you're going to see more Dollar Generals in there. And Walmarts do employ a bunch of people. They're not the best jobs, but other major retailers have these same issues. So when people talk about how there's not enough grocery stores in certain areas, this is a reason for that, because these grocery stores' profit margins cannot support being in these areas. So then these people end up with these little corner stores, and a big problem in these communities is they feel like the corner stores are upcharging them because the prices are higher in these corner stores. And there's a bunch of reasons, because they don't move stuff at high enough volume, et cetera, et cetera. But what people don't realize is that the prices are higher in these little corner stores in these neighborhoods, but the equivalent corner store in other neighborhoods is actually more profitable. They're making less money than you think, even though they're charging you more, because their insurance is higher, because if there's more crime, then it's more difficult to insure the property. Rioting does not fix that. Even if insurance rebuilds your thing, good luck on your premiums, for the next forever. The Detroit riots had horrible impacts on the city of Detroit that we still feel to this day.
Well, what you're talking
crime
about
is driving the poverty. It's not the other way around. You have to have the police in there to drop that crime rate, because why would I want to invest my money in an area where my goods and services are not being protected? Everybody knows this.
I don't think I would.
Well, hold on. Can I say a couple things to that? Yeah, because I don't think that you've demonstrated causality, right? I mean, the first step is that it seems like broadly most people who write and study on this thing, I don't like doing the broad appeal to authority, but I mean, there seems to be a pretty broad accepted consensus that poverty is one of the strongest predictors. If you have X, Y is more likely predictors of crime in an area. It seems really weird to take that and trying to get it backwards. And even in the example that you gave, you're talking about how people may not be able to access certain resources because in certain areas they may have to pay more. That's a product of poverty, right? Because they aren't able to get the things that they wanted to, then they may have to resort to other means to acquire whatever they need to survive.
But the crime raises the price in these neighborhoods. You can't operate certain stores that have bigger volume that will, provide low-cost goods. So you end up with these other stores that are charging more and making less because they have higher operating costs.
Yeah, but then in that instance, you'll probably end up more with gentrification, right? People have to be able to go to areas where they're going to be able to afford the things that they need to survive.
Well, gentrification works. There's a reason, as a New Yorker, I can't afford to live in Brooklyn now, even though 15 years ago, I wouldn't want to go to Brooklyn. The NYPD went in there, they cleaned that up, and then people were like, oh, you know what? The fancy brownstones in Brooklyn are just as nice as the fancy brownstones in Manhattan. Let's clean this neighborhood up and jack up the rent so even I can't afford it.
Except that gentrification is going to have a hard limit when eventually things get to such a point where eventually the quality of goods is going to start going down depending on how little that you're able to actually pay.
I agree. There's only so many frozen yogurt shops that you could possibly have in these neighborhoods.
You say that, but I mean this is a really big issue where a lot of people, because of gentrification, end up in things like food deserts, right? Where they aren't actually able to get any meaningful it ends up being expensive food, but healthy food because it's too expensive. You all know about Whole Foods, right? How many of you, raise your hands if you shop at Whole Foods? Raise your hands if you, all right, why do you not shop at Whole Foods? It's because it's fucking expensive, right? That's broadly the reason. But compare that to the cornerstone stores that you're talking about, or most other places where people in these communities are actually able to eat. The reason why they're able to shop there or at the places that they do is because they're cheaper, and because they're cheaper, they have to sell lower quality goods. And if people have to go just off of those, then they aren't really able to survive off of that in a lot of instances.
Food deserts are a myth in the country. If you go to any poor neighborhood, you'll see people selling fruit on the street for cheap.
All right, I don't know if you've ever been to Memphis, but this is absolutely a problem in Memphis.
People's choices people's choices determine what's in the store. They have had all these like initiatives to add more fresh produce. All you're doing is ripping off your local produce vendors when you're supporting that through government, by the way. And what ends up happening is people don't buy this stuff. They want the processed food. Like, we have an obesity problem, and it's not because like people can't figure out to eat fresh stuff in the United States of America. It's because it's cheap, it's convenient, and it tastes good. It's loaded
Wait, but
with
that's
salt.
exactly the
Can I
thing, is
add
that
on to
it's
that?
cheap. That's the whole point.
Oh, it's also convenient. Like, you have to like have
Well,
you
yeah,
ever,
I
have
mean,
you ever
like,
made
time
a
is always
salad?
going
You
to
have
be
to
a
like
factor in
wash it. Like,
I did a
like-
video like this.
I open SpaghettiOs. I eat it right out of the can, and
I did a video experimenting with this like 2 years ago, which I never posted because I thought that my takes on fat people would be polarizing to my audience. And so I never posted it, but I went down, I was like trying to, see if this was true. So I went down to 6 Mile in Livernois, and I found a grocery store, and I went in there, and they had produce, and virtually everyone in the store except myself and my cameraman was black. And then people were just buying like processed foods, frozen stuff. And there was all this produce there, and I was just kind of like, okay. And then I tried. The point of the video was I was trying to prove that you can eat by making your own food with a lesser cost than by buying processed food or McDonald's or whatever. It was proven. Obviously, this is true.
So why do you think, all right, so then the question is, why do you think that is? Why is there a difference?
Oh, that is the question, isn't there? Okay. I think that it comes down to basically a lack of discipline.
A lack of I mean, like, maybe. I don't, like, that's a pretty broad generalization.
I think
like,
that-
when we're talking about these reasons why these people make these different choices, it's probably because they're raised in poor neighborhoods where they get less access to education and they have less background to be able to know that these choices are harmful.
You're
And
not
who
going to convince me that
controls-
you're not going to convince me that Black Americans don't know the difference between pizza and a banana.
It's
Like,
not that
just
they don't.
like,
It's not. All right.
which
No,
is
it's not that they don't
healthier?
know the difference. It's just that depending on the places where they're raised, depending on the education that's available to them, depending on the kinds of investment in those communities, people might just be raised to think that like, this is kind of harmful, but like ultimately, like it doesn't harm me so much, and I don't fully necessarily, based on the education I've received, understand the importance of being able to make these certain kinds of choices. I mean, like that's a really big problem here. Is like a lack of investment in education, ergo a big problem in poverty, right?
It really like with all of the racism because education and then they eat more and then they get fat. It's like it seems like these mental gymnastics. Whereas, and this is a very basic conservative talking point which no one really elaborates upon, which is like fatherlessness. No one really talks about how that actually. They're just like there are no dads and then these problems happen.
Yeah,
but
it's a
like,
socioeconomic condition. Why do you think that's the case?
that there are no fathers.
Why do you think that there's like a lack of? I mean, this was discussed in the previous panel. I'm so sorry, everyone. Why do you think that is?
The Democrat Party has incentivized financially single motherhoods.
Okay,
so
you
as
just
to
talked about mental
consolidate power.
gymnastics, and you're talking about there's a lack of fatherlessness
That's
because
literally
of
true.
the
What was
Democratic
it?
Party?
Correct.
No.
Correct.
We absolutely are.
The coalition in which you operate, like simultaneously promotes feminism, girl bosses. Look where that got us, and then also like being a single mom is like empowering. And
I mean,
then
if we want to talk about what are the actual causes, we can
the
because we
Great
know what they
Society
are.
programs, the welfare, like Rogan mentioned, incentivize single mother. It is literally you have a financial incentive to have children out of wedlock.
What do you mean there's a financial incentive? You all know how expensive it is to raise a child?
Not when the
How
state
many
is
of you have
financing
raised a
it.
child in this room? I want you to tell me if it's cheap to do that. Does anyone want to tell me if it's cheap to raise a child? Anyone want to tell me that? No, abso-fucking-lutely not.
You just made an argument against welfare.
yeah, in the
No,
state,
I'm making an argument that welfare is necessary because it's fucking expensive
Raising
to
a
raise
child is
especially if you
expensive.
live
I know.
in poverty.
I wish I didn't have to pay for it. I wish money wasn't taken from me, a poor, downtrodden, demonetized YouTuber, and they're taking money and then using that to pay for other people's children. It's just like
I think that any parent, and I think that any actual parent who's in the room, especially after going through this recent pandemic, who's had to pay for a child, is able to reasonably recognize it's fucking expensive to be able to pay for a child, and you want to be able to pay for them. So it can be useful sometimes to be able to have extra welfare or to be able to have some kind of program to be able to help you, because despite your best efforts, despite being a hardworking American, you might not be able to, or you might have to short sell your child. I don't know about you. I like being able to make sure that if I were to have a child, I would be able to give them a healthy food that they would like to eat, and otherwise ensure that they're happy. I feel like that's a good thing that we can all broadly, don't you all agree that it's good to give our children healthy food, that it's good to give them a good upbringing? Like, these seem like things that are broadly important.
why was the poverty rate in this country decreasing up until war on poverty was declared? I mean, we spent like, what, $1 trillion on this, and we've seen no results.
Wait, hold on. What programs are you actually investing in? Because that's a really big part of this, right? Depending on the ways that you invest and try to resolve this issue of poverty, then you're going to have mixed results.
I am just confused because as a citizen, I look at the history of the country and I would be inclined to think, whether it's because of the institutions, the demographics, we have become culturally less racist. However, homeownership rates between white Americans and black Americans virtually haven't changed as far as their discrepancy since the Civil War. We now have more, compared to 1960, black families in poverty, a greater wage gap between white and black men, white and black women. Like all of these metrics would suggest that things are
why do you
getting
think that is?
worse. Well, I don't know. I'm asking you. If we've become less racist, which I would imagine we would have as a country, why are all these things exacerbating?
Because we're talking, and we're bringing this back into the beginning, right? This is the issue that people talk about with systemic racism, right? We're not talking about a bunch of people
Which
who are
system?
individually. We're not talking about a bunch of people who are individually racist. I'm not calling you or you or you or you or anyone in here like an individual racist. We're talking about systems that were set in place or that were developed long before any of us were alive, that we're kind of stuck with today. So we got to do something about
The
it.
systems of giving welfare money to these people, the systems of affirmative action, diversity quotas, all of these things that have been literally designed to help the supposedly downtrodden people in this country.
Yeah, they have helped.
No, they haven't, because all the metrics which we just went over have actually gotten demonstrably worse.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
I don't know. I'm asking, and you tell me the
I'm
system. Which system?
Yeah,
I don't
we're talking
see
about
it.
a lot of systems, including, hey, let's bring this back to police reform, right? That's one example
Circling
of
back.
systems.
Let's go.
Yeah. And so that's why it's important to be able to recognize investments in these sorts of communities is like a way to try and resolve the system, but it's obviously not the only way that we're going to resolve the system because, as you said, these problems have still gotten worse or haven't improved. So we want to be able to invest in the communities to try and reduce poverty, and we also want to reduce policing because, and I know that you two probably, like, I want to pick up on the point, where you said that, like, if we look at over this past year in cities that have reduced policing, that they've still seen increases. Like, broadly speaking, we've observed increases in violent homicides across all cities, regardless of political affiliations, regardless of whether or not those cities actually changed their police reform policies.
But it was like
it's
a
not
lot in those others, like a comical amount of murder.
Yeah, but no. But we're talking about, or what we're talking about here is that, like, the thing that you're talking about, like, whether or not the cities that reduced their policing had any causal effect on this. Like, not only is there no way to tell if that was the causal effect, but there's also other cities which didn't have these changes, which also saw the same kind of increases in crime. So when we look at that, it seems to suggest very highly that actually the reduction in policing wasn't the causal factor and that it was something else. I mean, we can do more studies on this, and that would be awesome. I love doing more studies. But right now,
it's because you guys control academia.
Well, yes, I like doing studies. I like figuring out what's what. That's a good thing.
This whole, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this in the audience, like the whole, like, do you have a source for that claim? It's just like, it's so tiresome.
Yes, I like to make sure that when I say things, I've actually done research into them.
Right.
Like,
So
I think that this is like a
you
broadly
Google
good thing.
things and then, like,
Yeah. Thank you.
it's like, yeah, we can applaud the fact that, like, the left has controlled education for 70 years, and that, like, that's the problem. with the whole,
Wait, are we going to conspiracy about the left controlling all academia?
like, only 5% of I think college professors identify as conservatives. I would
All right,
imagine.
so let's go. All right, so let's go back to this.
In the humanities.
Yeah, well, that's where these things.
Yeah,
are
well, let's
coming
go.
from.
All right, let's go back to this whole causation, like getting the things backwards. Like, do you think it's even possible? You're talking about, like, oh, maybe crime actually causes poverty instead of what I was saying. Do you think it's actually possible that people on the left just generally, like, actually listen to data and evidence more?
No, I think that there's like a top-down system throughout which you are able to basically consolidate this sort of homogenous narrative, which will ultimately create like a one-party state.
Oh, really?
And you can also go to imright.com and find a statistic data point for anything that you want to prove.
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, like, I make sure, like, it is important to make sure that you don't cherry pick the sources that you're using. It's important to make sure that you read all of the data on the subject matter, which I feel like I have on the subject matter. Like, I'm trying to come into this in good faith. Like, if there's an opposing study, like the one that you mentioned, I want to read that shit. I want to be able to engage with it. Like, I want to make sure that I'm not spreading misinformation. That's the point.
But to his earlier point about welfare, and I think that is good, but to his earlier point about welfare, in the state of Georgia, you literally cannot receive welfare unless you're a single parent. Like, if you have a two-parent household, you will not be able to get it. And it's not like people are having kids to be on welfare. People are already on the margins. If they worked, they would lose benefits and have a net decrease as taxpayers. So they line themselves up to get the most amount of benefits. And this is obvious. People respond to incentives. That's what economics is all about. It's not saying that all these people are scammers or even all these people are actually really single parents, although the distinction between being married and not being married and cohabitating is significant in outcomes for the children. But there's a lot of people that live in, that will live in, they'll have a man that actually does live in the home, but they won't be married specifically to maximize the amount of benefits that the mother can get. Like,
Right.
I mean, look, I do my taxes. I'm not saying I'm above this. I do my own taxes, and I take whatever deduction I can possibly get because I'm responding to financial incentives. It's what we all do.
Can I build on that really quick? I think it's interesting, like, the policies which we've seen from the coalition that I assume you're operating in, whether it's with welfare programs or with diversity quotas or affirmative action, now it's like, okay, well, we have to actually do this time because that time it didn't work. It is literally one-to-one the same as, well, that wasn't true communism. This time we have to do it this way. It's like your side can't seem to like work within the way things actually work, and so you have your studies and your data to try and get people to believe things that are contrary to what we know and what we see intuitively.
But I mean, there's a pretty big difference between those two things. Is that first off, like
I was just examining the parallel thought processes which seem to sort of manifest all over your policy
except that
corkboard.
there's a big difference between actually being able to experiment with like demonstrable and like doable policies today and like trying to compare that to trying a system that a lot of people would argue has never actually happened in the world. I mean, like, there's a pretty big discrepancy between, like, oh, yeah, no, that wasn't true communism because people say it's never happened, and, oh, well, that policy didn't work. That was exactly how we wanted it to work. It didn't work out, so let's try something different. Like, there's a pretty big discrepancy between those two kinds of thought processes.
I agree, but the point being that, like, we've basically yielded the issue to your side for the last several decades, and
my side, I'm just fucking in a
I would
master's
imagine,
program. I just am
what I would
studying,
imagine
like,
is your side,
what-
and resultantly things have
I'm
just
just
gotten
on the
worse
side of
by.
I mean, I guess if academia is left leaning, then sure. But I mean, like that, like I'm just trying to study this shit and figure out what's best for everyone.
Right. So that coalition basically has exacerbated all the metrics that we've gone over earlier. Whereas if you actually like ask, like Rogan.
Wait,
talked
academics
about,
have exacerbated all the issues in society?
I'm going to insert real quick. If you do want to ask a question, line up now, and I'll let you continue.
Yeah.
If you actually talk to, and this is what I really like about black men, is because black men don't have to like be politically correct like white men have been conditioned to. And so if you like ask black men what's wrong in their communities, they'll tell you. Look at Kanye West. I would argue that Kanye West is a better ambassador for the black community than anyone on the stage. This man said President Donald Trump has dragon energy. What does that mean? It means that black men respect strong male leaders because they know that in order for order to be restored in their communities, they need that presence in there because clearly what we've been doing hasn't been working for them.
So that's like a cool anecdote, but that doesn't really have to do anything with the fact that like the data seems to overwhelmingly suggest the things that we've been talking about. Like that doesn't really
It doesn't though. It just simply like the things that we've been talking about, we've basically
like
been like...
you're basing your opinions off of like Kanye West. I'm
And
not sure if
Donald
that's
Trump.
the best way to be able to like base your public policies.
Riley, you're going to have to bring
I wanna
the data to
apologize
the
for
bar tonight, and
I
we'll
mean,
review
like,
it.
Listen, if y'all want, like, it's on my, like, for people who want the things I've been relying on, I make it open source. I compile it all neatly and nicely. It's like the link at the top of my Twitter or like most of my social media, and I have business cards. So if you want one, then you can get one from me.
All right, cool. All right, let's start the Q&A. Who's first up? Michael.
Two things. One, diversity quotas have been unconstitutional since Bakke versus California. Doyle, you would do good to read your common law. Two, according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, so one thing I'm noticing on this panel is a lot of people don't want to contend with the idea that systemic racism is real. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, black men serve 20% longer prison sentences than white men for the same crime when controlling for criminal backgrounds. If that is not systemic racism, what explains this discrepancy?
Who wants to field that? John?
Yeah, I'll respond to the first part. As far as diversity quotas, true, there's not like a literal, like you have to hire this many number of people, but we've seen mega corporations from banks to communications companies saying that like we're going to try to hire less straight white men, which would ultimately mean, of course, more non-white people, more LGBT people are going to be hired, which I would argue is basically the same thing, even if not precise. As far as the discrepancy, you mentioned it goes away when it controls for like, what, criminal record or something like that?
He made the assertion it didn't go away when you control for criminal record.
Yes, it does.
It doesn't seem like it does. No.
And there's a multitude of factors, whether it's prior criminal record, whether it's the actual like event that led to the arrest. There's also the behavior during that, their conduct while they're actually like in the courtroom. There's just so many factors that go into these things, and it's like you can pick the most obvious one that'll leave like a 15 to 35% discrepancy, and then you just assume, well, that's because of racism then.
Well,
It's
yeah,
like
but I
these-
mean, the studies that he talks about, if I'm remembering them correctly, I don't know, maybe I'll be corrected on this later, but it seems like the study specifically controlled for those factors. Like, racism seems to be one of the only other ones, unless there's some other factor that we haven't considered yet.
I can think of one. But first to your first question about quotas being illegal, sure, but I used to design graduate courses on public administration, and it's kind of funny how Harvard, Yale, all these Ivy League institutions and most colleges seem to find the same amount of qualified Asians, whites, blacks, and Hispanics year after year. Like, it's really weird how, whatever percentage breakdown that they get, they get for 20 years, every year over year. It's almost like they have a system to figure out who they want in the class. But as far as the sentencing, I believe that was federal sentences. You could correct me if I'm wrong. I thought it was 10%, not 20%. But most of these cases are plea bargains. So, like, yeah, sure, same crime that they end up with, but we don't know what people were charged with initially. We don't know how good of representation you have. If you can't negotiate a good plea bargain, which 95% of the cases get resolved via plea bargain, then you're going to have shittier sentences.
But it seems like, well, I mean, like, it is a problem where we have, like, overcharging of people so that they have something to plead down from. Like,
I agree on that. Overcharging, like, it's a pain in the ass to force somebody who can't afford a lawyer into a plea bargain it's disgusting.
Yeah, so that could be, like, you would agree that, like, that could be an explanatory factor in what we're talking about. Yeah? Okay, cool.
All right, you ready to have your mind blown here?
Yes.
Sentencing disparities, I agree. Systemic racism. And what bill caused that? The 1994 crime bill. Who authored it?
Joe Biden.
Joe Biden. And who signed it into law?
Clinton.
Bill Clinton. The Democrat Party is the source of systemic racism in this country.
I mean, every Republican supported it too. It was supported by everyone in Congress. I mean, like, I agree, like, it was terrible, and it shouldn't have been passed into law, but, like, let's not pretend that, like, everyone didn't affect it.
But it also goes to show how hard it is to craft policies, because the whole point of mandatory minimums is, like, we're going to get rid of these fucking judges. I'm telling you, they're biased. They have all these problems. We got to straighten that out with mandatory minimum sentences. And then we do that for 20 years, and all of a sudden the mandatory minimums, which were the solution to racism, become the new racism. So,
And who did prison reform?
I don't know.
President Trump.
All right, let's fire it up. Next one.
It's very simple, guys.
Dovetailing on this, I'm going to make a couple of assertions and then get to my question. And I'm surprised this didn't come up. Fewer laws result in lower crime. So laws such as drug laws, for example, and gun restrictions are both, in particular, are based on racial fear. They were spawned out of a South that was afraid that, in particular, black people would be drugged up and that they would have guns. That's why we have drug laws. That's why we have gun laws. So if we lower the number of laws that police have got to target, I would think, this is my thinking, we will lower the number of crimes that are being committed, and we will also help normalize some things. So my question would be, how willing are conservatives and Republicans to eliminate drug laws, and how willing would progressives and Democrats be to eliminate gun laws in order to help these impoverished communities not get trundled into jail every single time they get pulled over?
Can I say something? Or,
It sounded like that was directed to Republicans.
the last part was,
It was both and,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
as was mentioned just now, both parties are party to this.
Yeah. So I like to use the Uniform Crime Report for my crime statistics, because it picks specific crimes that if we all like talked it out, we would all think should be illegal. Rape, murder, like robberies, like felony assaults and all that. I'm fine in reducing, if not eliminating, most drug laws. Like, I don't care. Like, legalize marijuana. You guys want to go smoke up, that's fine. Like,
yeah. Joe.
Like, I think you're a little dorky. I think you're a little dorky that you're always talking about it, but I'm actually totally on board with that. But like, in terms of like when I talk about crime, I hate the drug argument because it's just annoying. I specifically refer to the Uniform Crime Report and murder, like everything that we think should be illegal, or the National Victimization Survey, because you're interviewing victims and they're not victimized by their own drug use, so that's not in there. So yeah, sure, but it's not what we're talking, or at least what I'm talking about when I talk about crime. And like, you need murder laws.
So I won't comment on that. I mean, like, I agree to get rid of them. I'm not sure if I agree with all of that, but like, yeah, drug laws, yeah, we should probably get rid of them. Or like war on drugs or whatever, yeah, pretty cringe, not based. Probably should get rid of that. Eat that shit. Other laws, as far as like other reforms on policing. So we actually do have some data that like in cities that have instituted like better restrictions on police use of force. So for example, like the constitutional standard for police use of force is a reasonableness standard, right? So that basically says that like when police reasonably believe that excessive force or that use of force is necessary to prevent the death or grievous bodily injury of another person, then that's when they could use force. And a lot of cities and a lot of states are starting to look at instituting a necessity requirement, that instead of just a reasonableness requirement, that it's a higher standard, that like, oh, you have to think it's absolutely necessary to use force. And what we see is that when cities and states implement this, that overall the amount of police excessive uses of force go down. So like there are some that we can be able to tell are like reasonably good, and also maybe like requirements on police body cams or other kinds of accountability things. Like it just seems good to make sure that we can hold, like not only protect police, but also make sure to hold them accountable because they have one of the hardest jobs in our country, namely to be able to protect us from violent crime, right? Like it's a really sensitive subject because we want to protect them, but we also want to make sure that we're holding them accountable. So yeah.
Okay, next one. Or did you want to stand for drug laws? You know,
I'm not afraid to take that position. I will take that position if I have to. But see, here's the pot smokers are like, dude, come on, man, just try it. Like, if we had a society where you could get like 2-day shipping, Amazon Prime, MG249 to your front door, like I would probably take the going away with drug laws for that. That would be epic. However, he brought up plea bargains. I do know that a lot of these nonviolent drug offenders who are in prison on a plea deal because they plead guilty to possession of something, but it was actually they're being charged for higher crimes. I'm curious to get your thoughts because I don't know, but like, what do you think would happen if, say, we eliminated all marijuana-related crimes or something, and that possibility for taking that deal would go away? Do you think that would be a positive or negative for the way that the prison sentencing goes?
I think it probably would be an overall positive. Like we don't want to leverage crimes that people probably shouldn't be charged for to begin with as a way to try and get them on other charges. Like that seems like a problem more of the structuring of the criminal justice system. Like it seems really weird.
That's like the intimidation. Yeah. It's like what's the line? T. Grizzly said, like, them crackers wanted 30 years. I told him, holler at me when you sober. We love T. Grizzly, Detroit pride. And it's like the same thing. It's like they're going to come in your face and be like, oh, wow. They're going to be like, yo, dude, you're going to sentence you to 30 years for prison or maybe 5 years if you just say that you had weed on you. And then people panic. And it's like this very predatory sort of approach.
But we can be able to, like, reduce sentences. Like, for a lot of sentences that people end up facing in the criminal justice system, there are mandatory maximums. There's not as many mandatory minimums, though, right? So people, like, if we want to, or if officers want to do this, like they could be able to like say, hey, we're going to charge you for this and we're going to do like this many years or this kind of sentence, right? Like they can always take it down. It just seems really weird that we're like basically in a position where we're ending up charging people for crimes that we don't even want to be charged as crimes, right? Like that seems unjust to me. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but that...
All right, go ahead, next person.
Yes or no for the panel?
A little closer to the mic.
Yes or no for the panel, do you believe that if we continue to give up our civil liberties with bills like no-knock warrants or forfeiture of property and the endless privacy issues, if we continue to allow police to escalate into a military force on our streets, will we eventually eliminate or reduce crime?
Yes.
Except that we've seen, like, we already had this discussion earlier, that more policing does not always result in reduced crime.
I'm going to be honest, I stopped listening after he was talking about the police getting like militarized because I started like envisioning myself like clearing my subdivision of like blue helmets.
Okay.
No-knock warrants, I don't know if they should be 100% banned, but they should be in situations where you have a serious belief there should be a much higher standard for them. Ironically, the case that we use to justify the banning of no-knock warrants is the Breonna Taylor case, in which the cops knocked, and after they knocked, her boyfriend grabbed his gun, shot the officer in the leg. If they would have just actually executed the no-knock warrant, she would still be alive today. But overall, we should definitely like reduce the use of them. Like they shouldn't be kicking in your door without any expectation that they're going to be met with some serious force. That's what that's for, so that if you're going to attack the police, that you don't have time to get ready. And I think we way overuse that.
Yeah, and I mean, like moving on, like talking a little bit more about that. I mean, like police, like no-knock warrants were like we want to talk about like history, right? So like those were established during the Nixon administration, like during the war on drugs era, right? And it seems like that, and like at the federal level, when they were first instituted, they actually resulted in so many disproportionate uses of force that Congress ended up getting rid of it at the federal level, like within, I think it was just like a couple of years after. And so they've just been a really big problem at the state level because the federal government's already realized, oh yeah, this shit causes a lot of problems. But like state governments still haven't quite gotten the message, even though like not only do they end up causing harm to people, they cause a lot of harms to police officers, right? Like when you break into someone's house and you don't do anything to let them know, then people are probably going to think, oh shit, my house is broken into. And because, hooray, Second Amendment, people have guns, you might shoot at someone who you think is breaking into your house. That's justified. But if we get into these situations where we're sending police officers basically off to die, I don't know, like again, I want to protect them. So we should probably get rid of them.
And we should fight back against the door maker lobby that wants the no-knock warrants there, because no-knock warrants harm doors.
Everyone wants to talk about big pharma. No one wants to talk about big door.
Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, I was interested in this discussion on how
A little closer to the mic.
how policing should be done, and I'm curious, is there anybody in this room who's ever actually made an arrest besides me?
So if it's any consolidation, I've worked with police. Like I worked in the organized crime division of the Maryland Attorney General's office. That's not the same as making an arrest, but.
Okay. Well, the thing is that my experience with the vast majority of my misdemeanor arrests was, except for they went to jail, I did no harm to them.
Yeah.
You said that if the police were doing their job, they did harm. I wasn't doing harm. I was benefiting society.
Well, did any of those people who you arrested end up going to jail?
Yes.
All right. That's what I'm talking about, right? Like that is, like let's two things here, right? That can be good. That's going to cause harm to their families. If you take a person who provides a massive amount of income to like out of a household, then they aren't going, like that income is gone. All right, that family has one less family member to be able to support themselves. That's harm. Now we say as a society that that ends up resulting in better outcomes on the aggregate, but like that's what we're talking about, right? Like it's retributive justice. Sometimes it can be good. It's just better to, like don't use too much of it. It's probably bad.
I've never made an arrest myself to answer that question, but I have handcuffed a few women.
Nice, Sean.
I'm so happy
nice.
for you.
It's too bad Brittany Simon isn't here. Go ahead.
Hi. So I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on a topic that has actually been on my mind before. In the course of discussing police problems, what we've talked about is statistics with regards to white Americans and black Americans. But I think the panel kind of agreed that one of the main distinguishing factors is the state of the community that the policing is occurring in. And so what are the panel's thoughts on us kind of redefining this conversation about police reform in terms of the communities, right? Because we end up talking about like white communities and black communities, but really the thing seems to be impoverished, disadvantaged communities. And that seems to be the most controlling factor. When you bring up race, it seems to distract people. People start talking about all these different things when it seems like the most important factor is the state of the community. What are the panel's thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, the reason why, because, in principle, if we were to, take this on good faith, then I would be likely to agree with you, right? Like, the thing that we probably want to care more about on the aggregate is poverty. Unfortunately, we're in this situation where because we have, one or a couple groups which are disproportionately disadvantaged in society and end up being poorer on the aggregate, then this ends up negatively affecting them as well, right? Like even if one of the core issues that we're talking about is poverty, which we should be addressing and which should be a big part of the discussion, because of the fact that it negatively affects certain groups, then they become part of the discussion as well, right? That's basically my thoughts on that.
Anything else out? Okay, next question.
This is mainly for Riley.
Hi.
Hi. Where do you draw the bright line between over-policing and under-policing, and how much does the individual responsibility of citizens in an area contribute to that?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. I wanted the panel to get there eventually because there's a cool policy discussion on the matter of what is over-policing, because it's a really open question in terms of the studying of the subject, right? So the answer is probably going to be broadly, if we wanted to use proportionality to violent crime, that could be a good metric. essentially what we would want to do is probably do like some experimentation where we end up reducing it, see if it ends up causing more harm or causing less harm, and just keep messing around with that number until we get to a point where we've kind of like minimalized the amount of crime that it causes just from reducing the amount of policing, but then also we've like maximized the amount of policing that we're able to do while keeping that in mind, right? And at the same time, we probably also do want to invest more in like social programs to be able to help those communities. You know, like a lot of times in poor communities, police have to respond to like people with mental health issues, right? Which is really a big problem. Now, the police often are untrained to be able to deal with mental health issues. That doesn't mean that you don't send someone who actually is able to use force if it is necessary, but you probably either want to have some more training so that police are better able to deal with those people, or you want to like send some kind of a social worker with them, right? Like some combination thereof, but like that would be the short answer is like whenever the good that they provide does not doesn't end up outweighing the harm that they would cause inherently. That would be my answer.
All right, next question.
Hi there. This is a question for Rogan. So you brought up how when Irish people came to America, they were treated like dogs and not really very well and had a lot of fighting tendencies. So why do we not talk about today like the Irish crime stats or the being targeted by police at an abnormal rate? Disproportionately, I should say.
Well, it's a good question. It brings me back to the beginning of the movie The Departed, I believe, where Jack Nicklaus is narrating. And he says, you know, we fought and finally we got the presidency, you know. So I think it's a combination of things. Part of it is how, you know, the economic policies that are chosen by these people. I think that you know, maybe there's less of an allegiance to a certain party, although I will say being in Massachusetts, there's very strong allegiance to the Democrat Party for better or worse. I used to live there. But I don't think there's as much of an institutional allegiance to the Democrat Party, which is a big problem, I think. And it just goes back to my original argument that there is no worse catalyst for black communities than Democrat Party policies just based purely on the results. And, you know, I'm someone that really, I speak with Candace Owens on the Blexit tour sometimes and, you know, been friends with her for years. And I am one of the loudest people that's trying to welcome black people into the Republican Party. I truly want to help them. I think President Trump did incredible things for them. The lowest black unemployment ever. We had rising wages. He initiated the economic opportunity zones to actually help these communities. He did prison reform, which reversed Bill Clinton and Joe Biden's anti-crime bill. So I think they would achieve a lot more success for their communities if they gave us a shot. And you know, but unfortunately, there's a powerful force that wants to keep them in the Democrat Party because there's a lot of votes there, and they'll continue to manipulate them. But I think if they did make a change one day and come and give us a shot, that things would work out a lot better. And honestly, what have they got to lose? The last 50 years have been an absolute disgrace.
Can I build off on that? As a fellow Irishman, the people who were coming over here in the 19th and 18th century, or I should say 19th and 20th century, like somewhere between 33 and 50% of them coming from Europe went back to their countries once they decided that they didn't get what they wanted from here, they wanted to bring that wealth back. There weren't in place the policies like you're mentioning as far as creating this sort of dependency state at that time that would have kept Irish immigrants, for example, down and sort of dependent upon those policies. You literally had to like sink or swim when you came to this country because there was no welfare state at the time.
Yeah, okay. Unless you had something out, just getting a few more questions. Go ahead.
This is more towards the conservative side of the panel. Riley brought up earlier that among other comparative countries, our police kill more people per capita. And I was wondering if you believe there's some reason towards that, or if it's just because, you know, Americans are more likely to have guns or whatnot. What do you think is the solution to try to bring down those higher death rates among Americans because of police?
Higher death rates among whom?
Our citizens, our police are more likely to kill Americans than other countries' police are for their
Okay,
citizens.
so you're kind of asking, like, for the Republicans or conservatives, like, what their idea of, like, common sense police reform ought to be?
Yeah,
okay.
basically.
Well, I think it is mostly attributed to the fact that there's guns everywhere in the United States of America, and if you're an officer, you always have that in the back of your mind in a way that's just not the case in other countries. Again, the London police don't carry guns because that's how like low their encounters of people with guns actually are. As far as like a solution for it, I mean, stop resisting arrest, stop reaching for a gun, stop running from the police. Like, you know,
But you can't put all of the onus just on the people who are being arrested for that.
Yes, I can. Not all. You're right, but
just simply don't get arrested.
Yeah, I mean, this is literally just just don't commit crime, forehead, or like just don't be poor, forehead.
I do agree. You should not commit crimes.
All right, yes, you shouldn't commit crime. Don't commit crime. Do not commit crime by virtue of the fact that you live in communities of poverty. Just don't be poor,
if you
forehead.
do commit crimes, don't run from the police because even when they intend to tase you, sometimes the police are incompetent, just like other people, and you could get shot.
Right, but I mean, we talked about earlier, like we mentioned the fact that in cities where you've had like higher restrictions on police use of force, like for example, raising the reasonableness to a necessity requirement for use of force, that we've ended up seeing better outcomes both in terms of protecting the police and also in terms of reducing the amount of harm caused to people, right? Like I don't know why we wouldn't say that like doing that, maybe having just like better police training so that if there is any people out there who are individually racist, we can take care of that. Like a lot of things I feel like I've been proposed, like I've tried to be like very reasonable because I feel like a lot of these things are not like too far out there.
All right. Cool. Can we get in one more, Justin, or not?
1 minute.
Okay. Who's next? Got 1 minute.
Riley, this question is directly for you, but it is open to the floor.
Okay.
What do you have to say to woke leftists who feel that the police system cannot be reformed and that we must abolish the police?
It's a bad argument, and I don't agree with it.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Do we have one more? One more? You want to get in? All right. All right, just eke one more in. All right, go ahead.
What do you think of automation in the police force in the future, like RoboCop?
Oh God, the robot dogs? Oh God, I don't even know how to feel about that. That is beyond. That is some sci-fi shit. Like I don't even want to think about that.
I am strongly against it.
I just want to say that is a sharp-looking shirt, and whatever content creator puts out that merch, it's high quality from an artist.
I think we all can agree,
think
given what we've seen, that the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. Thank you.
Broad agreement. Broad agreement. Thanks, everyone. We have a 5-minute break. Next panel. I appreciate everyone.
Thank you all.